African literature, literary works of the African continent. African literature consists of a body of work in different languages and various genres, ranging from oral literature to literature written in colonial languages such as French, Portuguese, and English. Traditional written literature, which is limited to a smaller geographical area than is oral literature, is most characteristic of those sub-Saharan cultures that have participated in the cultures of the Mediterranean. In particular, there are written literatures in both Hausa and Arabic, created by the scholars of what is now northern Nigeria. And the Somali people have produced a traditional written literature. Works written in European languages date primarily from the 20th century onward. Oral literature, including stories, dramas, riddles, histories, myths, songs, proverbs, and other expressions, is frequently employed to educate and entertain children. Oral histories, myths, and proverbs additionally serve to remind whole communities of their ancestors' heroic deeds, their past, and the precedents for their customs and traditions. Essential to oral literature is a concern for presentation and oratory. And it is also to be noted that music comes as an integral part of oral literature of Africa. Some of the first African writings to gain attention in the West were the poignant slave narratives, such as the interesting narrative of the life and adventures of Aulada, which described vividly the horrors of slavery and the slave trade. And it is to be noted that later on we see that Africans started writing in their own languages. They often reacted against colonial repression in their writings. Often they looked to their own past for subjects. Modern African literatures were born in the educational systems imposed by colonialism, with models drawn from Europe rather than existing African traditions. But the African oral traditions exerted their own influence on these literatures. And it is also interesting to look at the narrative strategy in oral literature. The storyteller amazingly combines the audience's present, waking state of mind with the past condition of the semi-consciousness. And so the audience walks again in history, joining its forebearers. That's how they try to link the present to the past. That's how they tell their children stories of their forefathers and their foremothers. And thus history becomes the audience's memory and a means of reliving of an indeterminate and deeply obscure past. In other words, storytelling is a sensory union of image and idea, a process of recreating the past in terms of the present. The storyteller uses realistic images to describe the present and fantasy images to evoke and embody the substance of a culture's experience of the past. Storytelling occurs under the mesmerizing influence of performance. The body of the performer, the music of her voice, the complex relationship between the performer and her audience. It is a world unto itself, whole, with its own set of laws. Thus, performance gives the images their context and ensures the audience a ritual experience that bridges past and present and shapes contemporary life. The other characteristic features of African literature are that it encapsulates different periods in African history, from ancient Africa to the period of imperialist domination, and from the post-colonialist and Reconstruction period to the post-independent, that is, the contemporary period. It includes both oral and written literature from more than 3,000 ethnic African groups. It's regionally based, such as West African literature, North African literature, South African literature, and East African literature. Since the early 19th century, we find that the writers from Africa have used newspapers to air their views. Several founded newspapers that served as vehicles for expressing nascent nationalist feelings. French-speaking Africans in France, led by Leopold Senghor, were active in the Negritude movement from the 1930s, along with Leon Damas and Aimé Césaire. Their poetry not only denounced colonialism, it proudly asserted the validity of the cultures that the colonialists had tried to crush. In the same period, we see that various African authors produced works in English criticizing colonialist ambitions and advocating for independence. And these authors included Chinua Achebe, Paul Soyinka, and Nuita Singo. During the post-colonialist era, various authors denounced the practice of apartheid. These authors include Nadine Gordimer, Bessie Head, and James Coetzee. Last but not least, contemporary African literature often documents how corrupt modern African governments perpetuate the suffering of the African people. The writers of Africa of the period often shared the same themes, such as the clash between indigenous and colonial cultures, condemnation of European subjugation, pride in the African past, and hope for the continent's independent future. There has been much debate since 1963 whether literature written in English constituted African literature, and in 1963 itself, in Uganda, many critics and famous African writers gathered to clarify what is African literature or what is African English literature after all. What instigated this gathering was an essay published by O.B. Wally entitled The Dead End of African Literature, published in the year 1963, which stated that African literature written in English was not true African literature. And Achebe went against Wally's idea, but Nui agreed with it, saying that what was needed was to return to African languages. This position was agreed upon for almost 30 years, and in the 1990s, more and more Africans agree that literature written in English also constitutes true African literature. After all, it's the African voice, let it be in European languages or the indigenous languages. And it is also to be noted that at this particular juncture, many authors were involved in what is the idea of African literature and the role of the author in African society. Major themes of African literature were colonialism, liberation, nationalism, tradition, displacement, and ruthlessness in African literature defined as dominant. And it is also to be noted that African writers who wrote in English were often accused of addressing themselves to a Western audience, and to some extent they were engaged in a debate with the West about the Western interpretation of Africa, and in a sense they were directing a message both at the colonizer and the colonized. They were trying to reform African ideas about African experience, but they were also trying to reform European ideas about the African experience by using the colonizer's language to express his ideas. The post-colonial African literature is an expression of its country's social change. The writers are concerned about the past and the present history of their country, and this concern is reflected in their works. The social change that Africa had been subjected to since the colonization of the country, the cultural, political, and missionary influences and its present state of achieved independence, with a growing awareness of both national identity and modern problems. Liberation in literature challenges people, community, and the continent to identify the positive elements in their heritage and inspires them to find solutions to their problems. For example, along with the Yoruba culture, Paul Soyinka also advocates the theme of liberation in his works. Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian novelist, is considered by millions as the father of African literature. And no doubt Achebe has won so many awards for his contribution to African literature. In the course of a writing life that has included 5 novels, collections of short stories and poetry, and numerous essays and lectures, Achebe has consistently argued for the right of Africans to tell their own story in their own way, and has attacked the representations of European writers. But he also did not reject European influence entirely, choosing to write not in his native Igbo but in English, a language that, as he once said, I quote, history has forced down our throat, unquote. And thus we see that Achebe has given a new start to African literature, and therefore he is known as the father of African literature. Once Elaine Showalter has said that he has inaugurated the modern African novel, and Nadine Gordimer praises him high for his narrative strategy in his novels. Now, African poetry. It's a functional art. African poetry in its oral and written forms has addressed a variety of themes such as mysticism, values, religion, nature, negritude, personal relationships, anti-colonialism, pan-Africanism, and neo-colonialism, urbanism, African diaspora, and patriarchy, and universal valor, birth, death, betrayal, etc. Predominantly, the theme of African poetry was always the devastating effect of slavery and colonization, which resulted in English, Portuguese, and French, and as well as Creole or Pidgin versions of African poetry. And to speak of African poetry, there are divisions like pre-colonial era poetry, colonial era, and then liberation struggle and independence era, and post-colonial African literature, and present-day African poetry. Characteristics of African drama include protest against colonization, calls for independence, African pride, hope for the future, and dissent. And the theatre of Africa emerged in the post-colonial era, and that is from the mid-20th century. The roots of African drama could be seen in its oral tradition. It's narrating stories. The ancient literature has been transmitted orally from generation to generation. The storytelling performance itself is the essential part of oral literature. In narrating the old stories, the main point is the sung or spoken performance. Music, singing, dancing, mimicry, masks, and costumes may complete the oral text. The narrator improvises on familiar themes, while the performance proceeds within a fixed frame of traditional ritual actions, formulas, and refrains. Thus, a clear separation between oral literature and drama cannot be made here. In fact, oral literature is always at the same time drama in a way, because the performance is such an essential part of this literature, just as in modern written drama. Sentiments, mimicry, gestures, intonation, rhythm, and pause variation of moods,